You're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
On December 19th, 2018, President Trump announced a sudden withdrawal of all U.S. forces from Syria, where they have been involved in combat operations against the Islamic State. The next day, in protest of the decision, Secretary of Defense James Mattis, a former Marine Corps four-star general widely viewed as a stable force in a chaotic administration, submitted his letter of resignation. Just a few weeks later, National Security Advisor John Bolton appeared to roll back the president's original Syria announcement. The U.S. pull-up from Syria would not be immediate. Amidst the cabinet turnover and policy confusion, how has the landscape of U.S. civil-military affairs changed? What consequences does the Syria withdrawal have for our military and for our relations with other countries? What will be Mattis' legacy as secretary? And have events of the past 2 months contributed to further politicization of the military?
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex.
U.S. warships and planes launched the opening salvo of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
After years of devastating cuts, we're now rebuilding our military like we never have before.
Welcome back to Thank You for Your Service, a hard look at American civil military affairs from the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. I'm Nick Paraiso.
And I'm Thomas Krasnican.
The past 2 or 3 months have been pretty hectic, especially for national security, foreign policy, and civil military affairs. The nation's attention has been fixed on events and decisions with serious civil military implications.
Joining us today on the podcast is Kevin Weng. Kevin is a lecturer at the Committee on International Relations at the University of Chicago, where he researches civil-military relations, patterns of state-sponsored political violence, and Chinese politics.
Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you for having me.
Kevin, before we get started, I was just kind of wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you started studying national security policy and civil-military relations and the politics of militaries.
Well, I entered the University of Chicago as a grad student in 2011, and my original research interests were focused mostly on what I guess we could generally call great power politics. So powerful countries going up against other powerful countries, war, violence, those sorts of activities. But there was always something kind of impersonal about the way that I think a lot of the early series that I studied tried to explain international politics, and particularly the conduct of foreign policy. And so around 2012, I took a class with one of the professors in the Department of Political Science here, Paul Stanland, which was about civil military politics. I think the title was Militaries and Politics or something similar. And as you can probably imagine, that was a bit of an eye-opening experience for me. It really kind of exposed me to this literature that I had no idea it existed, to be perfectly blunt. And so basically I reoriented my entire dissertation project, my research interests, to civil-military relations, and I haven't looked back since.
Awesome, thanks, Kevin. Last month, the dramatic resignation of James Mattis from his post as Secretary of Defense garnered a massive amount of media attention. But in order to understand this event, we should take a look at the specific foreign policy debate that led to it.
U.S. troops have been deployed to Syria since 2014 in support of opposition forces in the Syrian civil war. U.S. goals there have been primarily to combat ISIS in the region and to counter Russian and Iranian influence. When President Trump announced in December that ISIS has been defeated and that he would move to withdraw U.S. troops within 30 days, he provoked a renewed national debate over sustained American engagement in Syria and the Middle East more generally. Now, a lot of members of the national security establishment have come out vigorously against the withdrawal of forces. In an article for the New York Times, David Sanger, who's a national security correspondent and a senior writer there at the Times, talks about how the president's view of the military is contrarian to established foreign policy perspectives. He writes that the lessons that many in the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies learned in the post-9/11 era, that deployed forces are key to stopping terrorists before they reach American shores and vital to maintaining the alliances that keep the world safe, never resonated with Mr. Trump. So he really gets at this established worldview of foreign policy, that it's necessary to maintain your alliances and it's necessary to kind of keep those troops abroad in that forever war in order to keep terrorism at bay and keep it over there.
The pullout from Syria has also been defended from some unexpected places. Andrew Sullivan, who's a liberal political commentator and editor at the Daily Intelligencer, wrote an article titled, "The Establishment Will Never Say No to a War." He talks about how the panic surrounding this pullout is overstated, this withdrawal is long past due, the wars in the Middle East are unwinnable, Americans have wanted to get out for a number of years now, but the national security establishment keeps pulling us back in. At one point, Sullivan writes, "There comes a point when a president has to say no to the neo-imperial blob, to cut bait in wars that have become ends in themselves, generating the very problems they were launched to resolve. There is never a good time to do this. There wasn't in Vietnam, and there isn't in Afghanistan and the Middle East. Sometimes you just have to do it."
Kevin, what are your thoughts on the foreign policy implications of the pullout?
So I basically view this debate as sort of a recurrence of an ongoing debate that we've had for a good portion of the United States' history, where you see sort of this relitigation of very similar talking points between these two sides. I guess we can generally call them the pro-intervention side and the anti-intervention side. And I don't see really anything changing with that debate. Yes, it's occurring under Donald Trump, but a lot of these talking points are not particularly new, so to speak. So the pro-interventionist sort of talking points you hear a lot. They say things like, well, this is bad for the United States' credibility, this surrenders the geopolitical initiative to our enemies, it's abandoning our commitments to our allies, and so on and so forth. And then you've got the counterpoint, which is, well, these interventions are expensive, it's wasteful spending, there's no clear end in sight, and we are seeing this very problematic exaggeration of a lot of the strategic imperatives of continuous intervention. And looking at debates over, say, the United States military intervention into Iraq, to Afghanistan, even to Libya and Vietnam, even further, these are basically the same points that are brought up over and over and over again. So in that sense, putting Trump's Syria policy into context, there's not a whole lot new in terms of the substance that's going on here. There are two ways, however, in which I can sort of think of how Trump might be unique in the present-day context. So the first is what I sort of see as the impromptu character of the Trump administration's decision-making process. That whiplash, I think, is kind of new to recent memory. The second is you can compound this with the problem of the Syria pullout's potentially negative implications for what we could call the civil-military consensus building of U.S. foreign policy and how that might sort of affect the United States' policy in the future. And so if it were just one of those things in isolation, I think maybe this wouldn't be that big of a deal. But the fact that it's both at once under the Trump administration is problematic, to use a term that academics love to use.
So that brings us to another commentary that was written over this period by Alice Hunt Friend, who is a senior fellow at the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic International Studies. And in the Washington Post, she wrote this article entitled, "This is the One Norm Trump Didn't Break," when he pulled out of Syria. She says that the president deserves credit for involving himself in military affairs and for asserting an important norm, which is civilian control of the military. Kevin, if you had a chance to read that article, do you agree with her analysis, and how do you think this relates to what we have regarded in the United States for a long time as the classic theory of civil-military relations?
It's somewhat amusing seeing this article and comparing it to a lot of the early think pieces that came out during the early years of the Trump administration with the appointment of men like H.R. McMaster, John Kelly, James Mattis, because there was a lot of hand-wringing over whether or not the appointments of these men would be a sign of weakened civilian control. And now that McMaster, Kelly, and now Mattis are gone, the hand-wringing has sort of moved on. The concern is no longer about whether or not civilian control is being weakened, but whether or not the generals are no longer around to play the role of the adults in the room. All of which is ultimately to say that I am more in agreement with Alice Friend's analysis than I am with some of the more alarmist takes that I've read. I think that civilian control remains relatively robust. You don't sort of see Trump engaging in what in violations of what I guess Samuel Huntington would call the military sphere of competence, right? He's not sort of reaching deep into the officer corps and deciding which military personnel he wants to promote and which ones he doesn't want to promote, right? He's not trying to micromanage or even reform the standard operating procedures of the military at large. Now, that being said, there are two things that, if they were to happen, would cause me to backtrack from my current position. The first is, if we start actually seeing active duty officers saying no outright to the president, that would be of huge concern. The second, and I think sort of the more realistic concern, is what we could call the military shirking its duties to the president. So right now, with all that's going on with James Mattis and with previously Kelly and McMaster, these are sort of the replacement of top-level administration officials. But if we go lower in the bureaucracy, if we look at sort of like mid-level, career-level military officers, the active duty service members who are still serving, if we start seeing delays in the implementation of the president's will, if we sort of see willful ignorance of a lot of the orders that Donald Trump is sort of sending downwards, that would be another sign that civilian control is being undermined, or is less secure than we originally sought.
So this kind of civil-military discussion about the president asserting his civilian control of the military, right? That brings us to December 19th, when he finally announced the withdrawal of the troops. And according to news reports, Secretary Mattis went to the White House to try and change the president's mind. And then this happened.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good day from Los Angeles, everyone. We're coming on the air with breaking news. Secretary of Defense James Mattis, the man President Trump once called one of his generals, is resigning. The president tweeted moments ago that Mattis was retiring, but Mattis's letter to the president said he was leaving, so the president could have a defense secretary whose views were more aligned with his.
While much of the attention on Mattis's resignation letter focused on his disagreement with the president, it's important to remember that by resigning, he was reinforcing another important civil-military norm. The president has a right to have a Secretary of Defense who shares his views.
Despite that, there was a lot of concern over Mattis's departure. His decision to resign in protest of a foreign policy move led to some extremely dire reactions.
People might be so numb to this, and some of us are so numb. I can't underscore how serious things are right now.
Any one of the things that happened today would be written into the history of any other modern presidency as one of its worst days or the start of the end.
Senator Chris Murphy, the Democrat from Connecticut, said, "A Secretary of Defense quitting over a public disagreement with a president whose foreign policy he believes to be off the rails is a national security crisis." The Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, told CNN that she was sad and shaken about the resignation.
Our troops look to Secretary Mattis as a leader, and now he is going to be leaving them.
Republican Senator Marco Rubio said that the resignation made it abundantly clear that we are headed towards a series of grave policy errors which will endanger our nation, damage our alliances, and empower our adversaries.
There are even similar reactions abroad.
Mattis resigning, and in this form, in this letter, you would notice not one word of praise.
Norbert Röttgen, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the German parliament, said Mattis was the last man standing for what had been U.S. foreign policy since World War II. There was even alarm in countries identified as U.S. adversaries in Mattis's letter. Yue Gong, a retired People's Liberation Army colonel and military commentator in Beijing, said, "Even though toward us he was tough and vexing, the Chinese military felt assured dealing with this type of professional military man." Kevin, what was the reaction to Mattis's resignation?
Well, I certainly wasn't happy to see him go, and not necessarily because of my concerns about what this means for civil-military affairs, but more in terms of the high turnover rate of top-level administration officials really doesn't speak well to how this administration is conducting its business or its affairs. And it really doesn't look good to our allies. Now, in regards to the future of the United States' policy in Syria, without sort of forwarding my own perspective on that debate, I do think that if we want informed policy decisions to be made, it's really important to have advice